it's going to be Elain. I mean, he was the one who knew that she was a seer. A mate knows when something's wrong. No, it has to be Gwyn. His shadows literally react differently to her than anyone else in the entire Acotar universe. It's a sign. Yeah, but did you not read the chapter where he gave his sword to her, the sword he never parts with, that he like practically sleeps with? He wouldn't do that for just some random person. Did you not see Cassian's POV where he literally said that black and night court colors do not look good on her and they drain the life out of her? Obviously, she's not meant to be in the night court. Hey guys, he ended up giving the necklace to her. I mean, did you not even read that last chapter? Yes, but he gave Elain the necklace first. That was his first choice.
Excuse me, what? Have you guys heard of the tale of Lancelot?
No.
I think that may answer some questions on who Azriel's going to pick. Sarah J. Maas pulls heavily from folklore and mythology and historical literature to create her universes for her books. And a lot of the characters, the places, and the overall story arcs are pulled from these various folklore references that I think she's pulling from. And this is just my public service announcement to tell all the romanticy and book girlies who like learning about that stuff or want to know a little bit more about the lore that she's pulling from. I'm going to give a spoiler warning. If you have not read all 5 of the books in the Court of Thorns and Roses series, just click off now. If you've only read the first one, come back after you've read them all, because obviously there's spoilers ahead. So this is your last chance. 3, 2, 1. All right. Hopefully they're all gone. If not, that's on you. I warned you. In my little class curriculum, I'm going to go over the people, places, and things / creatures in SJM's Court of Thorns and Roses world building. I'm going to go over the mythology, folklore, or sometimes literature references that she's pulling from, or at least I think that she's pulling from. I'm also going to give some theories of where I think the characters of the story arc is going based on this folklore that she's pulling from. So we're going to start with the characters that started the whole series, Feyre and Tamlin. So the first book in the series, Court of Thorns and Roses, obviously pulls very heavily from a Beauty and the Beast retelling. That's obvious, so I'm not really going to dig into that. Plus, I think everyone's already heard of that and they've seen it. If you haven't, you can just go watch the movie. But something that I think she's pulling from is the Scottish legend of Tamlin. And she just took the name and just made it Tamlin. And I'm not going to read you the whole lore, but I'm going to put up the screenshot. So if you guys want to read it, you can pause the video now and read it. I'm going to just give a TLDR summary and I'll point out some of the similarities. The legend goes a knight named Tamlin is captured by the Queen of the Fairies. In the Acotar universe, this is Amarantha. There's this realm of humans and then also the Fae and fairies. And this human woman, Janet, goes to a place called Cartenhog. Sorry if I mispronounced it. She's warned about going there, which is similar to Feyre going into Prythian, the Fae realm. Janet ignores the warnings about the dangerous fairies and she encounters Tamlin. She falls in love with him and decides to rescue him from the fairy queen, kind of similar to how Feyre decides to go rescue him from underneath the mountain. So Janet, she's determined to rescue her lover. She goes back to the forest. She encounters a series of supernatural challenges, including facing the fairy queen herself. And she uses her wit and her bravery to overcome these challenges. Very similar to what Feyre uses, her wit and her bravery. So Tamlin in the original Ballad was human and he was captured by Queen of the Fairies. But Tamlin in the Ballad did have the ability to shapeshift, which is something that our Tim Tam in Acotar can do as well. And one of the tasks that human Janet to rescue her Tamlin had to do was to hold on to him while he went all through these different transformations into different beasts. Tamlin is Tamlin. Janet is Feyre. Fairy Queen is Amarantha. Another thing that I want to point out about Amarantha is her name comes from the amaranth flower, which has a lot of symbolism in Greek mythology. The amaranth flower is tied with death and immortality. And Amarantha in the Acotar universe, she's immortal, and she also definitely is surrounded by death that she causes. She kills a lot of humans, she kills a lot of fairy kids, tries to kill Feyre multiple times, so that's a cool little comparison. The Beauty and the Beast retelling is also kind of interwoven with the Ballad of Tamlin, and just another familiarity between the Beauty and the Beast and Acotar is Belle in Beauty and the Beast. Her name in French is Beauty, and then Feyre is also Old French for fair, which is another word for beautiful. So we're gonna move on to the Three Sisters and the Bat Boys. I see this topic come up in all the videos that I watch. Maiden, mother, crone. And I get it, I do. But that's also just like the most basic interpretation of the Three Sisters motif and the individual lore I think that the characters are based on, specifically like Elain and Azriel. I think it's just so much deeper, and just stopping at maiden, mother, crone is a little shallow. I also just don't think it fits. None of these characters of the Three Sisters are crones, and I get that technically Feyre goes from maiden to mother throughout the series, but I just think it's a little patriarchal of an interpretation of like the three-faced goddess, where they're putting women into these three set roles that they could be, maiden, which is like a young virginal woman. It feels very male gaze to me. And then mother, I feel like women as a whole are already characterized by motherhood. And then crone, a withered old hag. I don't think any of these characters are a crone. I've seen people be like, Nesta's the crone. No, don't do that. I also don't think Elain is like a maiden. I think her character is much more deep than that. And I think just saying that she's just the maiden is a little bit of a shallow understanding of her character, which I hope SJM will go into in her next two books. Moving on to Nesta, one of my favorite characters. No one can ever make me hate Nesta. But what I think is a really cool connection that we see in Greek mythology is the name Nestor, which is the elderly king of Pylos in Greek mythology. He's famous for his sage advice. He's featured in Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey as a respected elder who fought in the Trojan War. To me, this kind of evokes Nesta because she's the eldest daughter and very protective of her family. Another Greek goddess that when I was reading specifically Silver Flames, I started thinking of when thinking of Nesta's character is Artemis. Artemis is this Greek goddess of the hunt, wilderness, and childbirth. And I know that that kind of sounds like Feyre, but when you think a little bit more of Artemis's character and her stories, her lore, she's much more associated with independence and vengeance. And to me, that definitely gives more of a Nesta vibe than a Feyre vibe. I don't see Feyre as really a vengeful character. And although Artemis is associated with, childbirth, she actually is not a mother herself, and she will never be a mother as part of her lore. She is a protector of women in childbirth, which definitely reminds me of Silver Flames, how Nesta saved Feyre during childbirth. She's also associated with things like instant death or sudden death that she can bring about, which definitely reminds me of Nesta, especially with the death trove and the mask. So those are the kind of things that kind of evoke Artemis when I was reading the last book in the series. And a fun thing about Artemis's character is that, she has a dual nature to her. She's very much a protector of women in labor and young animals. And she's also a bringer of sudden death. And it kind of reflects the harshness of nature. And I think that also holds true for Nesta. She can be a very harsh character, but also a very fierce protector. Maybe this is a little bit more of a stretch with Nesta's character, but that's just what I was thinking. If you disagree, please let me know. I've seen some other TikToks floating around that people associate Artemis a lot more with Feyre, being that she's the goddess of the hunt and she's seen with bow and arrows. Both can be true.
I want to go into Azriel, what I rage baited everyone in the intro video to continue watching this video for. I also see a lot of Azriel being a reference to the Judeo-Christian angel of death, Azriel, spelled a little bit differently, but I see this connection a lot, and I do like it. We do know that, and I'll go into it further in the video, she does pull from Judeo-Christian mythology and references throughout the series with Amaranth and then the Book of Breathings. There's some references there, but I think the more interesting reference is Lancelot from Arthurian legend. Azriel's storyline follows very similarly to Lancelot. Lancelot is one of the most trusted advisors of King Arthur. Azriel is one of the most trusted advisors of Rhysand. And Azriel and Lancelot have 3 love interests. The first being Mor or Morrigan. The second being Elain or Elain. And then the third one being Gwyn or Gwynriel. It's hard to ignore the similarities. Like, I definitely feel like there is no way that this is a coincidence. That the 3 love interests, what I would argue in that order, are for those characters. So let's go a little bit into a summary of Lancelot and these 3 love interests. So the first love interest that appears and then fades out of the story pretty quickly is Morrigan Le Fay, which is Mor in the Acotar universe. In Arthurian legend, Morrigan's almost portrayed a little bit like an evil queen. Her relationship with Lancelot is antagonistic and more tied to her desire to control and almost humiliate him. Obviously, I don't think Mor's character in the Acotar universe is going this far, but I do think there are some similarities. Not with, I wouldn't go as far as humiliation, but there are definitely scenes throughout the book series where she just kind of put him down and make him not feel great instead of just telling him straight up, hey, I'm not interested in you. The second love interest that we have is Elain. When Elain meets Lancelot, Elain falls madly in love with him. Lancelot does not seem to fall in love with him as much. It seems more that he cares about her, but never truly romantically loves her. And Elain has a love that she thinks is based on, destiny and prophecy. There's even one time where Elain disguises herself as Gwyn to trick him into sleeping with her. So throughout Lancelot's story, he also has a love interest with Gwynriel, who is married to King Arthur, and he ends up rescuing her many times throughout the series. I think this holds a little comparison to how he's already kind of rescued Gwyn and when she was found at the temple. The ending of the tale of Lancelot and Arthur that I think is not super relevant. I don't think that this is going to happen in the Acotar universe, but Lancelot's affair with Gwynriel is discovered. Lancelot has to fight his way out of Camelot, and Gwynriel is captured and condemned to burn at the stake. So Lancelot turns around to go rescue her, ends up killing lots of Arthur's knights in the process, which leads to a war between Lancelot and Arthur. And I saw an interview where SJM said that there's going to be a betrayal in the next series, and maybe this could be it. Hopefully not. I would hate for Azriel to go to war with the inner circle. That would be so upsetting to me. But I do think if we're pulling the connections between Lancelot and Arthurian legends and Azriel's character, I think it makes sense to put eggs in the basket of Gwyn. Now,
Do I know that this is exactly what she's pulling from? No. I'm just drawing similarities, and it looks pretty freaking similar. The names match up pretty well. So that was Azriel. Now I'm going to go into Rhysand, our favorite shadow daddy book boyfriend. Everyone is definitely making the connection between obviously Hades and Rhysand, especially with the second book being Hades and Persephone retelling. I also think it's interesting that Feyre's last name, Archeron, is one letter off from the river in the underworld in Greek mythology, Acheron, or I think I'm pronouncing that right, where people cross this river to enter into the realm of the dead, Hades' realm. She's also said in a lot of interviews that Rhysand is based on or inspired by her husband, and we love him for that. What a great muse. So the last of the three brothers, Cassian, the Lord of Bloodshed, Prince of Bastards. I also just love that the fandom has like jokingly made him into like this himbo of a character. I see it on TikTok a lot, and I love it. Cassian is obviously pulling a lot from famous war deities and soldiers throughout different mythologies and folklores. Cassian is derived from the Latin name Cassius, a name associated with warriors, possibly meaning helmeted warrior, based on what I looked up. I also think he's pulling from or SJM is pulling from the Greek god of war, Ares, specifically with that title, Lord of Bloodshed. It sounds very similar to Ares, Lord of Bloodlust. Another interesting parallel is that Ares is known for his spear, and one of the more iconic moments of Cassian being, I guess, living up to his name in the middle of the Battle of Hybern was when he threw the spear almost like an impossible distance with impossible accuracy. And also Ares is associated strongly with his armor, and then obviously Cassian is associated with his armor with the red siphons. Everyone in the fandom draws him in it too. So those are some interesting parallels. So that being said, we're going to move on to Nyx, little baby Nyx. So obviously I'm not sure of a lot of lore that, that character is pulling from. I don't even know if SJM has that figured out yet. I will just say that Nyx is a reference to Greek mythology as well. There's the Greek goddess of night, a primordial deity born from chaos in Greek mythology. Nyx is a really powerful ancient figure, personifies night, and is also the mother of many other deities like sleep, Hypnos, and death, Thanatos. She's often depicted as a dark-robed winged figure, which wings Illyrian, who travels across the sky on a chariot or lives in the underworld, which with Hades and Persephone retelling in book 2, the underworld is also a good connection. And Nyx's realm in Greek mythology is sometimes thought to be the deepest parts of the underworld. So interesting. I know that the names typically mean a lot. For SJM, they almost always reference a character directly. So I think it's interesting that she called Feyre and Rhysand's son Nyx. I think that is some interesting foreshadowing. So the next character we have, which I love the symbolism with, is the Morrigan. Her power is truth. So I see so many people on TikTok being like, what does that mean? Her power is truth. What does that mean? Hopefully I can give a little bit of context on the Morrigan character from Celtic folklore that I think she's pulling from, and potentially what the truth could mean. So we talked a little bit with respect of Mor's character to Azriel's character as Morgan Le Fay in Lancelot, which again I do think holds water. But then the other aspect of her lore and mythology that SJM pulls from is the Celtic Morrigan. So the Morrigan is one of the most powerful figures in Irish mythology, always referred to as the Morrigan. This is because it's her personal name, but also used as a title and a proper noun in Irish folklore and mythology. It's considered rude in Irish culture, like with respect to talking about this lore, to drop the. So I think it is important to note that in the books, when the humans, are talking to them when they're meeting, that they refer to it as the Morrigan. Think that is a direct call out to the Irish lore. So in Irish lore, who is the Morrigan? She's a shape-shifting Irish goddess associated with war, prophecy, death, and sexuality. She often appears as a crow or a raven. She's an ancient magical race, which is the mythic equivalent of the Fae in the Irish mythology. There's a ton of similarities between the Morrigan's character and Mor from Acotar. The Morrigan's described as super fierce warrior goddess. Rhys describes Mor as one of the most powerful warriors in the Night Court, who they will call on when Azriel and Cassian fails. She's associated with prophecy and truth. And Mor in Acotar, her power is truth. Seems like she can sense lies a little bit, or moral and emotional clarity. The Morrigan is also associated with sexuality, sexual freedom, and complexity, and Mor has a queer identity that's canon in the Acotar universe as well. The Morrigan is described as strong but dangerous and beautiful, and this matches Mor's character in Acotar. I would describe her as all three of those things. I think Mor's power of truth is similar to the Morrigan's ability to observe fate. The Morrigan isn't just a goddess of battle. She's considered a prophet and a speaker of truth and a shaper of futures in Irish mythology. So I think this maybe adds a little bit of clarity to her power is truth, comparing it to the Irish Morrigan. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she changed it up. Maybe she just took the name and went rogue with the powers. Hopefully we'll see in the next couple of books, but this is just what I think she's pulling from and could maybe add some context to that. We mentioned Amren a little bit earlier. We're going to talk about Amren now. Amren is inspired by a Judeo-Christian angel, like a biblically accurate Old Testament terrifying angel, an angel of death, a fallen angel, if you will. I think SJM did actually officially confirm that Amren is an Old Testament angel in an interview, but I'm not 100% sure, so someone's going to have to fact check me on that. But regardless, there's so many things that point to this being the case. The first off is Amren's form, essentially just how she looks. So Amren's original form is not the high fae that we see all the art of. It's not humanoid at all. In order to get out of the prison, she says that she gave up her, quote, grace and perfect immortality to bind herself and her soul into a high fae body. So if her form looked remotely humanoid or fae-like, this wouldn't even be notable to Amren. This also, again, makes me think of Old Testament angel, because if you look up what they look like, they are terrifying. I'm going to put some pictures up on the screen, but yeah, they do not look like humans or high fae at all. So the fact that she had to give up her form to turn into this form is significant. She also later on describes, when she's asked who she is, she says that she was a messenger and a soldier assassin for a wrathful god who ruled a young world. So Amren came to Prythian through a rift in the sky. She was curious of this rift while her brothers and sisters, the other angels, were scared and cautious. She went into the rift because she wanted freedom and she was curious, and angels are not supposed to want and feel and want to seek freedom. So that made her a fallen angel by wanting to go into the rift and by wanting to feel and experience what it's like to be a human, or a high fae in this case. The rift opened up. They had just laid waste to twin cities. In the Old Testament, this is Sodom and Gomorrah. They essentially had just laid waste to those two cities, leaving it rubble and dust and not a living thing left. That is how terrifying Amren is. And these Old Testament angels weren't the gentle helpers that you associate an angel with. They're extremely powerful divine entities, typically tasked with either like demolishing
wiping out armies or giving really complex divine messages. So this matches what she says with she's saying she was a messenger, because in the Old Testament they are tasked with giving messages to humans. And then the Old Testament angels were also frequently depicted as a divine army or a heavenly army, acting as soldiers, warriors, and protectors. They would just execute God's will in military-like ways, like destroying entire cities or armies. This matches with what Amren said, calling herself a soldier assassin. Also, let's talk about the blood. We know Amren, at least before she is remade by the cauldron, she drinks blood. I think it's specifically called out that she drinks lamb's blood. Also, when she goes through Valaris in Acotar, checking for any more of Hybern's spies, people leave jars of lamb's blood on their door for her, so she knows not to come in there and that they are not Hybern spies or enemies of her. This also happens in the Bible, where people put lamb's blood on their doors so that the angel of death passes over their house without harming them. Because any house without the lamb's blood, people are going to die. And this is a direct call out to the angel of death in the Old Testament in Exodus, where God instructed the Israelites to put lamb's blood on their doors so that the angel of death, the destroyer, would just pass over. So which type of Old Testament angel could Amren be? First off, I think obviously referencing the angel of death from Exodus with the lamb's blood. And I also think she could be referencing seraphim. And that's specifically because of the form that she takes when she's released and in the middle of battle. She is described as being a burning light of fire and just destruction. Seraphims, Old Testament, terrifying angels that are beings of fire and light, like Amren is described. They're not even meant to be seen by mortals. They're associated with just purification through destruction, laying waste to anything and everything. And they're often described as like burning and radiant, but also lethal. So a few other things that point to this theory, or maybe not theory if she did confirm it in that interview, is in Acotar, where Rhys gives Amren the Book of Breathings, and it is called Lashon HaKodesh. Apologies if that wasn't pronounced correctly, which is Hebrew for the Holy Tongue. And it makes sense that only Amren can read this book, because that is a language that doesn't exist in Prythian, because it comes from another world, Amren's world, where Amren speaks Hebrew because she's an Old Testament angel. All right, you have survived section 1 of the class curriculum. So we're going to move on to the second part, which is places. And Prythian itself, the name comes from Prythian, which is Welsh for Britain. And Hybern comes from, I think, the Latin word Hiberia or Hibernia, which means Ireland. And if you look at the map, it quite literally looks like Ireland and Britain. That being said, I think it's absolutely hilarious, the thought of Hybern/Ireland invading and attacking Britain. Historically, it's the other way around, but you know, whatever. So the names in world building in the Acotar series also pull pretty heavily from the book The Chronicles of Prythian. Even the name sounds very similar. The Chronicles of Prythian is a 5-part book series of children fantasy coming of age novels. These novels also have a cauldron in it. And one of the book plots is to destroy the Black Cauldron. The final book culminates in a great battle for Prythian and a struggle that will determine the fate of the land. And this is very similar to the Acotar universe. They have the cauldron. Book 3, all about a great war and battle to destroy the cauldron to determine the fate of Prythian being invaded by Hybern. Another thing that I think is really interesting is Illyria in the Illyrians. This is actually a term that the ancient Greeks used to describe a region of the western part of the Balkan Peninsula. Numerous peoples populated these areas, and they're known collectively as Illyrians. And And this region itself, IRL, is actually quite mountainous, which we know matches with the Illyrian kind of areas in the Acotar universe. They're all mountainous. The next one I'm going to talk about is Calanmai. I didn't know if I wanted to put this into like things or places. I'm going to put it in places. So Calanmai, I think, is directly pulling from the Celtic tradition of Beltane. Beltane is a Celtic festival marking the beginning of summer, happens on May 1st. It's traditionally celebrated with bonfires, which obviously we see in Acotar's Calanmai. There's a Beltane Fire Festival that still happens in Edinburgh. And the modern festival features, a dramatic performance between the May Queen and Green Man. Ancient celebrations focused more on purifying rituals, fertility, which Tim Tam is painted kind of resembling a fertility deity, and community gatherings to welcome the warmer months. Calanmai also is canonically on May 1st, I believe, which is the same date as Beltane. So drawing a lot of similarities with that festival. So if you want to feel like you're on Calanmai, maybe book a May 1st trip to Edinburgh and go to that festival. All right, we're on to the third section of my class curriculum, things/creatures. And this is a really interesting section because there are so many different creatures in the Acotar universe. And they all have different lores that they're pulling from, some of them more directly and some of them more loosely. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Naga. In Acotar, the Naga are a species of fae or fairies that enjoy hurting and consuming mortal humans. Feyre comes across them in book 1 of the series. So 4 Naga appear in the western woods of the Spring Court after they smell Feyre, and hear the scream of the Azriel, which she caught by leaving the dead chicken, and we'll talk about the Azriel later. They're described as, in the book, fairies with a humanoid top part or body, and then like a serpentine snake-like bottom half. Think a mermaid, but like kind of scarier. Covered in dark scales, with talons that are polished and black, and huge almond-shaped eyes that are amber in color with razor-sharp teeth. In real life Hindu mythology, the Naga, which means serpent in Sanskrit, are a class of semi-divine beings who are half human and half cobra. So the description, I think, that SJM is kind of painting a picture of really sounds similar to the Hindu Naga. In Hindu mythology, they are often considered more nature spirits and act as protectors for springs, wells, rivers, bodies of water. So I think that is where she's pulling the Naga from. I also think she could just be pulling from European marsh spirits as well. But I think the description of the Hindu Naga matches way more closely to what she was describing in the book 1 of the series. The second creature is the Bogue or the Bogey. Again, I read the book. I don't do the audiobook, so if I'm pronouncing it wrong, tell me. I think this is coming from Celtic, like the boogeyman, boggarts, the puka. They're shapeless fear creatures often found in European folklore. Feyre comes across them again in the first book, similar to the Naga. They're mischievous and malevolent spirits in European folklore, used to scare children into good behavior. They manifest as shape-shifting pranksters, often household gremlins, or sometimes terrifying creatures. And in the book, Feyre comes across them when she's riding with Lucien, and Lucien tells her, not to acknowledge or look at it, or it becomes a real threat. Unacknowledged, it can't harm you. So that's why I think the Celtic boogeyman and boggarts are where they're coming from. The puka, another creature in book 1 that Feyre comes into, she actually thinks it's her father trying to lure her out of Tamlin's manor. This is based on Irish folklore. Puka spelled the same. It's a shape-shifting spirit from Irish and Celtic folklore, which
often appears as a black horse with red eyes, but it can also take various different forms of humans, dogs, gremlins, all meant to lure people out. In Irish folklore, it can be malevolent, playing dangerous tricks on travelers, or it can be benevolent, ensuring a good harvest. Encounters often happen in lonely rural areas at night, which matches what Feyre did in book one when she saw it. She's, kind of in a countryside manor, and it's at night. Still in book one creatures, we have the Midgard worm. I think this is pulling from the Midgard serpent in Norse mythology. Also, I think it's so funny when I see TikToks and they said how I imagined the worm Feyre was battling, and it's like the SpongeBob giant worm, when it's actually like essentially just a wingless dragon. It's got like the sharp teeth and all that stuff. But in Norse mythology, the Midgard worm is so large that it encircles Earth, or Midgard, as it's called in Norse mythology, and it's also Loki's child. So another book one character, everyone's favorite, the Azriel, the tea spiller. So Feyre comes across it multiple times throughout the series. There's multiple characteristics that I think are interesting about this character that Lucian introduces to her, is that they cannot lie, they're not members of any court, they can't cross running water, and they will answer questions truthfully if asked, but not completely. Potentially misleading or in mischievous ways too, to omit information but still answer truthfully. So the Azriels are said to be older than Prythian, and even older than, quote, the bones of this world. The cauldron is older than the Azriel, though. Important to note. So there's multiple different influences to vampiric and fairy myths. Not crossing water is super common in a lot of different vampiric myths and folklores. The whole truth, knowing, and telling aspect of the character has ties to folklore and mythology, kind of like leprechauns and fae oracles. Also puka references to Irish and other European myths that are bound by fate to reveal truth. I don't think there's any one specific source that SJM is pulling from. I think it's a combo that she's kind of made into her own, like a mismatch of different inspirations to make this fun character that we all love. Moving on into the later books, we have what I think are very interesting characters are the three death gods of the Acotar world: Koschei, the Bone Carver, and the Weaver, all siblings. So obviously all three of these are death gods. I would say that the Bone Carver, the Weaver, and Koschei are actually renditions of the Greek fates, because they tend to know things that they shouldn't know, similar to fates. And the three fates are depicted as the spinner, the allotter, and the inflexible. So the Weaver, I think this is an obvious call out to the spinner. Clotho, it's a little too obvious. The Bone Carver, I think, is Atropos, who decides the way one dies in Greek mythology. This would make sense with why they are so fascinated with carving death. And he also shows Feyre her son, which does kill her. In the last book, she's brought back, but she does die. We also know that, he changes his appearance based on, who's looking at it. So could he be showing people the way that they die, or what kills them? I think is interesting, and fates would know that. So that would leave Koschei to be the decider of destiny if we're doing the Greek fate comparison. I wonder if any of those characterizations will come more into play in, the next two books that she's writing. I also think Koschei is also drawing inspiration from Russian folklore of Koschei the Deathless. I think this is almost literally a direct comparison to this folklore. The name spelling is exactly the same. Koschei hides his soul / mortality in a secret place, often in an object, but he's kind of impossible to kill as long as his soul's container remains intact. So in the Russian folklore, Koschei the Deathless. He's a powerful evil sorcerer in this Slavic folklore, infamous for his immortality. He kidnaps, in the Russian folklore, princesses, petrifies kingdoms, and is a formidable magical foe. So, similar with how, Amryn, I think, came from what we would say our world is, the Midgard worm came from Norse mythology in our realm. I would say maybe that these three death gods are also creatures that came from potentially another realm into the Acotar Prythian world, and that is where these creatures come from. I think it's also important to note that Koschei in the Slavic tales and is ultimately defeated in some of the tales if his soul's hiding place is found and destroyed, often by heroes like Ivan with the help of magical animals. I think the Weaver in the Woods is also strongly based off of Baba Yaga, Slavic tales and the Spider Woman archetype. Baba Yaga is a cannibalistic forest dwelling crone, which very similar to the Weaver. And Baba Yaga from Slavic folklore is both a fearsome villain, but also helpful. So if we are trying to draw some comparisons between this Slavic folklore that SJM, I believe, is referencing and the Acotar universe, I think maybe there could be a plot coming up with where the Weaver, Baba Yaga, is used to help defeat Koschei in some way, shape, or form. We already know that these death gods can be used by Feyre and Rhysand for their advantage, like in the war in book 3. So this isn't an outlandish theory, and could be interesting, especially if we're thinking that it's an Azriel book in book 6 or 7, which I think it will be, and the connection with the prison and these three death gods. I think something will come into play with that. Another thing that is a common trope in the SJM universe that pulls pretty heavily from mythology is this cauldron of creation. In Welsh myth, there is the Cauldron of Annwn. I think I'm pronouncing that right. But there is a collection of early Welsh prose called the Mabinogion. That was developed in the 12th to the 13th century. And there's also earlier oral retellings of these stories, but essentially in those Welsh prose stories, there's a magical cauldron that can create life, resurrect the dead, shape destiny, and it functions almost identically to the Acotar world's cauldron as a world creating life force giving and mating bond fate creation. It also shares a lot of similarities with the Chronicles of Prythian, which we talked about earlier. Both Acotar and the Chronicles of Prythian have this cauldron that functions essentially the same as in these Welsh stories. Another one that I think is interesting that I wanted to throw in here is the Ouroboros. The Ouroboros mirror, which is a world serpent eating itself, and then a mirror in the middle. Which kind of is a callback to the Midgard worm, where that worm, the Midgard worm, circles the earth and then bites its own tail. It's that big. So a lot of serpents circular eating themselves references here in this world. It's an ancient symbol representing eternity, self-renewal, and the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. It originates in ancient Egypt, but it appears across a bunch of different cultures and folklores and mythologies like Norse and Greek, and it signifies, creation and destruction. I do wish that maybe they had a little bit more symbolism or meaning into it. To me, and it just kind of seemed like a fun reference that was thrown in there and it didn't really impact a lot of the plot, but interesting nonetheless. So moving on to the last thing that I'm going to be talking about, and that is the death trove. The harp, the mask, and the crown. So there are some different items that I think she's pulling from mythology to make this death trove. The harp, I think, is the harp of Dagda in Irish myth. I think this is the strongest influence here. Dagda's mythical harp controlled the season, could kill or revive soldiers. We see this directly with Feyre at the end of the 5th book, where, Nesta uses the harp to revive her. It could move armies, played songs of sleep, joy, and mourning, and could defy the natural order of things. I think all of these really describe the harp in the Death Trope in Silver Flames. The Acotar harp can control realms and doors and death, and it plays different notes for, different types of magic. It's deeply tied to ancient creation, and it breaks the natural boundaries between things, the natural order. So I am pretty sure that this is exactly what she's pulling from for the inspiration for this. So thank you for attending my crash course into the mythology and folklore of the Acotar universe. I would love to do the 2 other book series that SJM does, because she just loves to sprinkle in that lore into all of her books. And I think it's really interesting. And I like theorizing what's going to happen in the next books based on the lore that they're based off of. So yeah, let me know if you want me to do that. If there's a different book series you'd like me to look into, I'd be happy to do that. And I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, like and subscribe, because this took a lot of time to research, and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.